before I start, I'd just like to say what an honour it is to be invited here to this beautiful city and to this wonderful university. I'm having a very good time in Olomouc so far. So thanks very much to the conference organisers. Today, I'd like to talk about Tibet. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the unrest in Tibet. I changed the title because I think the title of my paper was a bit long and boring in the program. Tibet is always a difficult subject to talk about. Usually when I speak about Tibet in Australia, I bring a raincoat, just in case somebody wants to throw a tomato or an egg at me, because Tibet is such a politicized subject that it seems as academics, as researchers, no matter what we say, we always seem to make somebody angry. So just before we start, can I check to see if anyone brought any tomatoes or eggs into the room? Hands clear? Okay, that's good. Thanks very much. Sorry. No, free Tibet. Well, often at these talks in Australia, we have a lot of activists from both sides that come and sometimes hijack the conversation. I'd like to talk about the recent wave of unrest in Tibet. And by the recent wave, I mean the wave that began in March of 2008. And specifically, I'd like to talk about some findings from a research project, or one part of a research project that's part of a book project on ethnic conflict in Western China that will be published by Columbia University Press next year. So my presentation today is in two parts. First, I'd like to review the events of March 2008 and the unrest since, and talk about some of the different interpretations of that unrest, and then get into some of the, what I think are the more interesting findings from my research, which is on a subject that I think is often understudied and overlooked, and that is the role of local government in conflict in Tibetan areas. Oh, and please feel free to interrupt me at any time. I enjoy that. If you have questions as we go along, please just put up your hand. I'm very happy to stop and talk about anything you want. So let me start by first quickly reviewing what happened. On March the 10th, 2008, some monks began a series of marches to commemorate the Dalai Lama's flight into exile in 1959. A few days later, on March 14th, a group of monks were protesting, demonstrating peacefully near the Ramoche temple in Lhasa. Police came and dispersed the protesters. This really upset some people in the crowd who were nearby, and they turned and they attacked the police, and they started to set fire to the police cars and to other official vehicles. More crowds joined them, and the protest escalated into a riot. Parts of Lhasa, for those of you who remember, are quite shocking graphic images from the television when they finally came out, were like a war zone. Some of the Tibetan protesters began to attack shops that were owned by Han Chinese and also by Hui, as well as citizens, Han Chinese and citizens in Lhasa. The Chinese media reported that about 18, or that specifically 18 citizens died as a result of the violence. At first, the security forces seemed overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. We suspect that they were waiting for political instructions from above. But when the authorities did respond, they responded with full force and sent the People's Liberation Army into Tibet for the first time in 20 years. They sent army reinforcements. Some of you might remember that the last spate of protests in Tibet concentrated in Lhasa in 1989, and martial law was declared for a year. This photo here is from the 5th day of the protests in Lhasa. After an initial news blackout, a war of words began in the Chinese and the global media. The war of words was, of course, between two very different interpretations of events. One of those interpretations, or narratives, if you like, was the narrative from Beijing and the Chinese media. The other interpretation or narrative was spearheaded by the Tibetan exiles and their supporters in the West. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, Beijing accused the Dalai Lama, who, as we all know, is a wolf in sheep's clothing, that's what they call him, of orchestrating the violence, that it was led by a group of exiled separatists who were determined to split up China and make Tibet independent. The media reminded the public, Chinese media emphasized the violence conducted by Tibetans. Here are a group of monks attacking Han Chinese-owned shops. This is an image from China Central Television. And also attacks on Han Chinese citizens, which was clearly designed to provoke outrage among the Chinese population. And it succeeded. The exile-based Tibetan groups, on the other hand, with the support of a generally sympathetic Western media, emphasised Chinese government repression and control, and blamed the failings of Chinese policy, the inadequacy of Chinese rule for the unrest. And they emphasised the repression, the crackdown, and exile groups estimate that more than 200 Tibetans were killed during the crackdown, and an untold number of Tibetans were arrested, many of whom remain in jail today. And I personally know many Tibetans who were arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite these polarised viewpoints, and we can talk about that later if you're interested, because it's not the focus of my research, there's one thing that everybody can agree on, and that is that the protests that began in March 2008 were the biggest and most widespread in decades. The most significant unrest in Tibetan areas since the cross-border guerrilla warfare of the 60s and early 70s, which some of you may know was sponsored by the CIA. That ended in 1974, by the way. They agreed that these were big protests, and they spread far and wide across the plateau very quickly into parts of Kham and Amdo, which are today in the provinces of Gansu, Qinghai, and Sichuan. This photo is from Amdo, and it was taken on the 15th of March, which is one day after the riots in Lhasa. This is really significant. This map here shows the sites of protests during the previous wave of unrest in the late 1980s, with some periodic unrest in the early 90s. And these are the sites. You notice that it's concentrated around Lhasa, or what's known as Utsang, central Tibet. These are the sites of protests since 2008. And it's significant how much the unrest has spread into eastern parts of Tibet, which, as you can see from this map, are administered by different provinces. Areas that were previously considered very stable. Since what's been a rather effective crackdown by the Chinese security forces on protests and demonstrations, protests, as I'm sure many of you know, have taken a new and rather drastic form, in the form of self-immolations. These self-immolations continue. My understanding is the latest figure is 122 since 2009. The self-immolations continue, as do periodic demonstrations and protests in many Tibetan parts of China, most of which we don't hear about because it's very difficult to get access to information, and the Chinese media tends not to report on a lot of these incidents. Local governments also are not interested for people not to know about these incidents of unrest. So my research is driven by a quest to understand this latest wave of violence, because for me it's a conundrum. As some of our previous presenters have pointed out already today, in Western China the state has invested staggering sums of money, not just billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, money that I can't, too many zeros, I can't really imagine it, in developing the West. Now, this has led to double-digit growth, massive GDP growth that all of Europe would be jealous of, and also clearly to rising incomes. So why, in the wake of all this, are Tibetans everywhere suddenly very upset? That's a question worth asking. Analysts, of course, have a lot of views on this, and generally there are two schools, or two approaches to interpreting Tibetan grievances. One emphasises social and economic factors that and this relates to some points that Tom made earlier, that the nature of development is causing inequalities, that Tibetans are being marginalised, that there is an increasing an amount of Han migration into Tibetan areas, that following the money and the economic opportunities, and that these Han migrants are, especially in urban areas, they are out-competing Tibetans for the best jobs. I think there's some truth to that. And there's another group of scholars who focus on cultural and religious issues. And they highlight that many of the protesters are calling for changes in policies in religion, in language, in education. And they also point to some of the suicide notes left by Tibetans who burn themselves as emphasising their despair with the direction that their culture is headed within China. So I think that there's some truth to that too. And indeed there is evidence for both. Again, this is a subject that's quite complex, and if people are interested, I'd be happy to talk with you more over lunch. But I think that one thing we need to be careful of is to talk about Tibetans as if they are one homogenous group of people. Just like we wouldn't pretend to say what all Czechs are thinking right now about the same thing. There are 6 million Tibetans in China, and some are farmers, some are doctors, some are government officials, some are old, some are young. And I think that when we talk about what issues are on Tibetans' minds, it depends very much on which Tibetans we're talking about. But let me move on to my, actually no, before I do I have a map. At least I thought I had a map. Not yet. So I'd like to come back to this, to my research on local government. Now the reason why I'm particularly interested in local government is because so much of the analysis and the criticism, if you like, of China's Tibet policy has focused on Beijing and what's happening at the centre. And the reality is that Beijing is a long way away from all Tibetan areas. And that Beijing, as the central or national government of a huge country, really only makes broad strategic policies. It doesn't really tell local governments what they have to do each day. They said, this is our goal, these are our directions, these are our priorities. Now it's up to you guys to figure out how to do that on the ground. And students of Chinese politics have known for a long time that local governments have a high degree of autonomy and they don't always do what they're told. They don't always follow Beijing's orders. And this phenomenon is encapsulated here. I invite the first year Chinese language students. Maybe that's not fair on first year. Where are the second year students? Second year Chinese language, third year. Can you tell us what that says?
I don't wear my glasses, sorry.
You don't wear your glasses? Okay, fine. These are two really common expressions that you hear in China. The first one is Shangdao Huangdiyuan, which means the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. I'm sure you can all imagine what that means in context. The other expression at the bottom is, you hear a lot when talking about local government, local officials. Shangyu Zhen's, oh, that's a mistake. I only get 8 out of 10 for my Chinese today. This should be Shangyu. Please. I typed that in a hurry just before.
Oh, it's not. It can be interpreted as we play along with.
So actually that could be very poetic. It was, but it was an accident. I'm not satiric. I'm not so clever. That was a mistake. Thank you. Maybe I'll leave it there now. Does anyone know what this can tell us what this means? Come on, Chinese students. I know there are lots of you here. Maybe you're a bit shy. All right, I'll tell you. It literally means above there are policies and below there are countermeasures. Very common expression which refers to the fact that local governments can basically do their own thing. So knowing that, my question is, why during all these years have local governments in Tibetan areas not been able to do more to keep local Tibetans happy? The Tibetan areas in China, as I'm sure all of you know, are divided into a number of regions for administrative purposes. The Tibet Autonomous Region is the area when Chinese say Tibet, they mean the TAR. So this can be confusing. Whereas in the West, when we talk about Tibet, we often mean ethnographic Tibet, or the entire area where Tibetans are the majority population. There are about 2.7 million Tibetans in the TAR, and a bit more, nearly 3 million Tibetans who live in this area outside the TAR, which is part of 4 provinces. There are, within those 4 provinces, Yunnan, Sichuan, Qinghai, Gansu, there are 10 Tibetan autonomous prefectures, the next level down under the province, and 2 so-called autonomous counties. So, why aren't all these guys, especially because their promotions, their career, depend greatly on the maintenance of stability in their areas, why aren't they being smarter? Why aren't they thinking, okay, what kind of things can we do in this place to make our constituents, to make our populations happier? How am I going to time? Okay, thanks. Keep me posted. So this is something that I find really difficult to understand. If you are able to keep a place stable, you get a lot of points, and there's a chance that if you're ahead of a county, you will get promoted to the next level. So why aren't they thinking, hey, what can we do better? How can we devise, develop policies at the local level, economic policies, social policies, cultural policies, that keep people happier? We're not talking about Tibetan independence, we're not talking about separatism, we're just talking about what governments should do for the people that they supposedly administer. So, Why have they failed? My research is about trying to understand what I think is a failure and what I think is a missing piece of the puzzle in understanding why there are so many problems in Tibetan areas. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, but it's an important one. This was actually an idea I got from Thomas yesterday to promote my book. So that was another thing that I stuck in. Because I should give this some context. I studied Chinese politics, and I teach Chinese politics. And so it's that background that I brought to studying local government in Tibetan areas. I have a book coming out at Stanford University Press on local politics in China. I'm not trying to sell it to you because it's not available yet. But I'm happy, if people are interested in this subject, I'm happy to send you a free PDF anyway. You don't need to buy it. Now, as part of this study, I've spent many years in China trying to understand why officials, government officials, do the things they do. What motivates them? What are the incentives? And I've spent a lot of time with local government officials, getting to know them, and it's been hard work. It's been fun sometimes, tiring at other times. But after a few years working on this subject, I think I have a really good understanding. There are other people, other scholars working on this who've helped my understanding also. What I've done is to divide, and for the purpose of this presentation, tried to make a compact presentation of my findings, is the focus on the incentives that local officials in Tibetan areas have. And I divide those incentives into two types. One is formal incentives, and the other is informal incentives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I argue, importantly, that it's the combination of these incentives that prevent local officials from being able to make smart policies. The first set of formal incentives that I'd like to introduce you to, and for those of you who don't study Chinese, does anyone study Chinese politics in Oz? Anybody? No, okay, this will be new for you. I hope it's not boring. The local officials in China are evaluated on the basis of 4 key criteria. Every year, your superior will sign off a report and you will get a score out of 100 for your integrity, your industriousness, capability, and your achievement or performance. Now, this is important because it's on the basis of that you become eligible for promotion, more status, more money, etc. So mostly we can assume that local officials are interested in that. Now, herein lies one of the problems that I'd like to highlight today. Increasingly, local officials are measured in quantitative terms. That is, especially when it comes to achievement, there are 2 main metrics for evaluating an official's, let's say a county, the head of a county, his achievement. And one is GDP growth. What was the last year's GDP growth for that county? 9%, 10%, 12%. Wow, fantastic. You get a good score. Now, this has a kind of a perverse consequence. Because, and this is true all over China, by the way, this is not unique to Tibet, is that the metric is GDP. So they are motivated, incentivized to do whatever they can to up the GDP. If you knock a building down and build it again, you're adding to GDP. If you smash your car and repair it, you're adding to GDP. Now, these are crude examples, but what I find is that this one-eyed, this myopic focus on GDP leads officials to promote economic development and projects that don't really pay attention to inclusiveness, to the consequences for who gets what, to how benefits are distributed. They just want to build, 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 build. And if that means that you need to bring in 10,000 Han Chinese workers from Sichuan, okay, do it, you know, let's build. Let's build it this year so I can be promoted. That's a problem. The second key dimension to achievement, or another way of translating Xi's performance, is social stability. So get the economy growing. This is the priority for Beijing. Get the economy going and maintain stability. How is stability measured? Well, it's measured by the absence of unrest or the absence of conflict. And the Chinese government has specific definitions from this. What is a mass incident? How many people demonstrating where, doing what? So these incidents you need to keep down if you want to get promoted. And so what that does is this incentivizes local officials to squash protest, to prevent it. In fact, in many parts of Tibet today, there are volunteers sent from local government into each village to volunteer and to see how everybody's going, and basically they're working as spies to report any information about possible potential protests. This is going on right now. And so instead of making them think about, okay, what do we do to address people's grievances, whether they're economic, cultural, they are incentivized just to keep a lid on it. And because there's a lot more money for security, domestic security, some of you may or may not know, but the Chinese government now spends more money on domestic security than on defense, external defense. Because they have all these resources, they use them to suppress dissent. And I think that's also a really big problem. The other formal incentive, 5 minutes, okay, I'm going to quickly finish now. The other formal incentive I'd like to talk about is the way in which governments in Tibetan areas are funded. And they are funded almost entirely by fiscal transfers from Beijing. There is almost no taxation in Tibetan areas, especially in Tibetan farmers. There's no tax, not anymore, and there didn't really used to be very much. So they're dependent entirely for their salaries, for their operating costs, for their projects, on money from Beijing. And so this means that officials spend a huge amount of time chasing the next project, just like we do at universities, chasing the next. I was talking to someone about that here just last night. So they're thinking, okay, Beijing, this department has money coming for this. Okay, let's quickly go after it. And so it's supply-driven. The money that's available for projects drives their thinking about what projects they're going to do, because they want the money. Why do they want the money? Well, I'm sure some of them would like to spend it to the benefit of the local population. You know, plenty of money is spent building roads and irrigation channels, and these things help people. But they also want money because there are opportunities to put it in your pocket, and a lot of it. I'm sure many of you have read lots of stories about corruption in China. Yeah, there's corruption everywhere. But in China, in Tibetan areas, it's really easy to be corrupt. There's so much money flowing into these regions. And the system of checks and balances, accountability is really weak, and also rule of law is really weak. Personal relations trump formal rules. So if you know the right people, you can get away with anything. And over the last 10 years that I've been travelling through the region, I've seen officials become filthy rich. I don't mean just comfortable, I mean filthy rich. They own multiple houses. They buy Mercedes cars. Most of them are smart enough not to do it in the place where they work. They buy all these things in the provincial capital, in Chengdu or Sichuan. They go there and they play. They send their children. People are coming to me all the time saying, can I help introduce them to a school in Australia? They want to send their kids to school. I pay all the fees, no problem. This is a huge change over the last 10 years. So somebody else made this point in Xinjiang. The state dominates the economy to such an extent that if you're ambitious, if you want to get richer, that's your channel. You go into working for government and you find opportunities to enrich yourself. So not only does this create huge inequalities, but remember, not just between Tibetan and Han, there are huge inequalities between Tibetans, those who are linked to the state and state employment, and those who aren't. And I don't have the graphs here, but there is a growing divide between urban and rural incomes in Tibetan areas. A colleague of mine did a study to show that the difference between incomes of among Tibetans was greater than between Tibetans and Huns in Lhasa. Interesting finding. Lots to talk about. So let me just finish up real quick by saying that all this money sloshing around creates a highly competitive political environment where everybody wants to control this position or that position so they can control the projects and control the money and so they can get rich. Now, what happens is that this is a very ruthless because it's dominated by personal relations, even though the formal criteria does count. Personal relations matter a lot. So you become risk averse. You're focused on the projects and the money, and you don't want to take any chances, you don't want to take any risks that might jeopardize your career. One of the things I forgot to mention is that in Tibetan areas, this measure, integrity, is mostly interpreted to mean loyalty to the Communist Party. So Tibetan officials, and this is different from other parts of China, especially if you are a Tibetan, are under constant pressure to demonstrate your loyalty to the Communist Party. And the best way you can do that is by disassociating yourself from the monastery. Don't want to know those guys. Not interested. In many places they are if you are a Communist Party official, you are prohibited from going to the monastery. They also disengage themselves from NGOs who they think might have a pro-exile agenda, and especially from international NGOs and from foreign funding. And so what happens is officials cut themselves off from understanding and communication with their local communities, but they also cut themselves off from access to global knowledge about how they might better develop their localities. So they become very inward focused. And the money that's sloshing around too, and the huge opportunities for self-enrichment really do seem to take up a lot of the time of local officials and leads them to prioritise profit over ideas. I'm going to stop. I'm out of time now. So, just in conclusion, I'd like to say that so far my research, which is yet to be published, in fact this is the first time for me to present findings from this study, suggests that there is a constellation between formal incentives and informal incentives which has a powerful, acts as a powerful force in shaping the behaviour of local officials, which I think prevents them from being creative, prevents them from being responsive, and prevents them from developing new ideas for governing Tibetan areas at the local level. What is the consequence of that? Well, I think we're going to see continued trouble on the plateau. I think there will be more unrest, more violence. So I hope that my research in a small way can contribute to a better understanding of its causes. Thank you.